Welcome to our class today on benevolent possession. We talked about malevolent possession before, in which, in particular, we were talking about how the ghosts of unhappy suicides would possess brides who had run off and separated from their husbands, and then the possessed brides would be brought back, and there would be an exorcism, and the goal of the exorcism is to turn the brides who are somewhat wayfaring back into very good and proper wives. Here you have a picture of some possession happening. Possession means when a god takes over a person's body completely. We're not talking about ghosts today that take over people to do harm. We're talking about gods that take over a person in order to do good or help that person, or enable them to give a vision of the divine to others, or for them to speak prophecies, or for them to do healing. This is the Navadurga, which means the 9 Durgas, or the 9 goddesses, that in an autumn festival, these dancers become possessed by the goddess, and they wander around the city, and people see them as being the very goddesses that are right there. So they perform, and on occasions they can heal, and they can do consultations to people and are oracles. But for the most part, these are folks who are possessed and then operate as living gods wandering throughout the city of Kathmandu. So what is possession? We've talked about entheogens, visions, and malevolent possession. So today we're going to talk about possession and to some degree trance. In possession, an entity takes over a person. Now this isn't harmful like we saw with the Pays. This is for good, and in fact the person who is possessed actually becomes put into a state of holiness in which they are thought to be representatives of the deities in the world, and their very state of being able to be possessed in this way shows their purity, their goodness, their spiritual advancement. So in these, the entity that possesses is a deity or a spirit or a godling, not a ghost, and when he or she possesses a person, it doesn't harm the person. The deity takes over, but does so for good. Now, what is the difference between trance and possession? Well, trance is entering sort of an altered state, but in a trance, a person isn't necessarily possessed. So we can go into a trance, but not necessarily be possessed by a deity. So if you do a long, specific type of meditation, or you're put under hypnosis, or you're doing biofeedback or whatnot, this is getting your brain to operate differently, possibly to connect to things out there, but it's not that someone is being taken over by an invisible outsider that comes into you and then you speak and act as that deity. You effectively become that deity. So like I said, trance is putting yourself into like an altered state of consciousness. We also have trance channeling. What I mean when I say trance channeling is someone who can put themselves into a trance and then begin writing, like either automatic writing, or the idea is that they become a conduit for something out there. That thing doesn't take them over, but you become a conduit to speak or write out or communicate through that thing. People that experience trance talk about feeling timeless. It's like sort of that flow state that people talk about, but even more intense. Some trances lead to out-of-body experiences where folks experience themselves sort of leaving the body. Again, this isn't something taking them over. Now, trance it actually comes from an old French term meaning passing or transitioning from life unto death. So it's complete, talk about a change of consciousness is going from life unto death. Now, trance can be cultivated. Some people enter it quite easily. Some people need to train to do it. So we have biofeedback, in which one gets one's brain a certain way that you can lower one's blood pressure or resist great amounts of pain. We also have self-hypnosis, where you can put yourself into a trance, or actual hypnosis, when you're put into a hypnotic state by a trained hypnotherapist in order to help you, I don't know, quit smoking or give you a hypnotic suggestion, sort of like to raise your self-esteem. So it can be used, you can put someone in a trance to psychologically manipulate them, hopefully in a good way, possibly in a bad way. There's plenty of bad horror movies about that. Trance can simply be experienced, in fact, by playing a long, repetitive video game. You'll feel that you'll kind of leave your body. There's a timelessness. You're just in that game completely. You can really have kind of a trance experience. Stephen King writes about how writing fiction is the closest thing he can imagine to active dreaming. So when he writes, he actually enters sort of a trance state in which he composes. Now, there can be complications here. A person in a trance is still themselves, but a person who is possessed loses memories and becomes another creature. almost all people, after they come out of the possession, say they have no memory of what occurred when they were possessed. So in this sense, a goddess can take over a person, but the person also takes over the goddess in the sense that they are acting out the goddess. This is sort of a both and. Some people will say, hey, is this person just acting? Is this just playing? Are they just pretending to be the goddess? I wonder, does that matter? I'm more interested in religious phenomenon and consciousness rather than, you know, these issues of, is it real or not? It's either all real or none of it's real. I think it's all real and none of it's real at the same time, but that's me. So in possession, a person's mind, speech, body, and maybe even soul are taken over by something else, some invisible creature that becomes embodied in the person who is possessed. Unlike trance, the person loses agency and control to the entity who is possessing that person. Now, we've talked a little bit about malevolent possession in the past. We talked about these pays and the brides that would take over, that would take over the brides. Personally, I'm not a big fan of the term demonic possession because you can't really understand what is a demon, what is an angel. Really settling on those universal categories don't really work. I prefer malevolent versus benevolent possession. So in Tamil Nadu, we saw that possessed women were caught by these pays, these ghosts of suicides, but they're also caught in a system that made their frustrations into possession states and then exercised those possession states, those pays, and then locks the women who were possessed into a ritual or into a system where they would have to be good brides and they couldn't act out in any way. We're not going to see that. We're talking about benevolent possession. Now, we didn't talk about malevolent possession. I didn't bring up in the last one, but I want to bring up one key point. When we think about possession, we are generally thinking more about demonic possession in the West, in movies like The Exorcist. But more so, we think about one of my favorite stories from the book of Mark. Mark chapter 5, verses 1 through 20, which I want to read for you right now. So we're going to turn to the good book, the New Testament, or as I just like to call it, the Christian Bible, or the Christian Bible. And I always like to go to the King James because it's a work of beautiful world literature. There's even scholarship that suggests that the author of Shakespeare was involved in framing the translation and getting the language also nice. And I think the King James Bible, nothing else is more beautiful of a translation than that one. I had a teacher who would always used to say, you know, you can look at the New International Version, you say, behold the hippopotamus. Whereas, you know, that's a little bit better. That's not like the King James saying, canst thou draw out Leviathan with a hook? All right, so we're talking about Jesus and his apostles, and they are wandering about doing their Jesus and apostle things. And then they came to the other side of the sea, to the country in the land of the Gadarenes. I don't speak Greek or Hebrew. And when he had come out off the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit, who had his dwelling amongst the tombs, and no one could bind him, not even with chains, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been pulled apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces. Neither could anyone tame him, and always, night and day, he was mountains and in the tombs, crying out and cutting himself with stones. So this is a man who is possessed. Intriguingly, people who are possessed almost in every culture break chains. I don't know if it's that people try to bind them up and they break them, or they'll show off breaking chains. But breaking of chains is something that I see cross-culturally with possession. All right, when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and worshiped him, and he cried out with a loud voice and said, "What do I have to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" Notice he recognizes that Jesus is the Son of the Most High God right off the bat. That's an interesting theological thing right there. "I implore you by God that you do not torment me." For he said to him, "Come out of the man, unclean spirit." Then he asked him, "What is your name?" Again, you always have to figure out what's the name of the spirit before you can exorcise them. And he answered saying, "My name is Legion, for we are many." Also he begged him earnestly that he would not send them out of the country. Now let's send the spirits out of the country. Now a large herd of swine was feeding there near the mountains. So all the demons begged him, saying, "Send us to the swine that we may enter them." And at once Jesus gave them permission. Then the unclean spirits went out and entered the swine. There were about 2,000. And the herd ran violently down the steep place into the sea and drowned in the sea. So remember, figure out the name, get the demon to speak. Here it's a demon. Get the demon to speak. Then you know what to do with them. Cast them out, put them into somewhere else. Before, we saw maybe put into a rock that the bride carried around and then she dropped. And then they put it in the hair and then they nailed the hair to the tree. They got to put that possessed, malevolently possessed demon or ghost somewhere. Jesus Christ throws them in a herd of pigs. So those who fed the swine fled, and they told it in the city and in the country. And they went out to see what it was that had happened. Then they came to Jesus and saw the one who had been demon-possessed and had the legion, sitting and clothed and in his right mind. So he's back to normal. And they were afraid because they'd seen how weird he'd been acting for so long. Then they began to plead with him to depart from their region. And when he got into the boat, the one who was possessed, he who had been demon-possessed begged him, Christ, that he might be with him. However, Jesus did not permit him in, but said to him, go home to your friends and tell them what great things the Lord has done for you and how he has had compassion for you. And he departed and began to proclaim in Decapolis, where he's from, all that Jesus had done for him, and all marveled. So this guy doesn't become an apostle, but he becomes, like, after being cured, he becomes a religious figure that goes out and preaches about the glories of Jesus. So we see a lot of overlap with our possession narratives of malignant or malicious or malevolent possession that we saw in South Asia. But we're not talking about that today. We're talking about benevolent possession, possession that is good. So, as I had said, in benevolent possession, it can be spontaneous or it can be cultivated. Spontaneous possession is like a quick trance with no trigger, or in all sorts of contexts, often in a religious context. Spontaneous possession sort of happens when someone's like just singing, or on a pilgrimage, or you're up all night meditating, or you're, in a ritual drama or something. Suddenly, boom, you're out. You go into a trance. So that's, spontaneous. Or there's cultivated possession, and that's where, you're going to be possessed. You're planning on it. You're doing rituals around it. You're getting into costume. You're knowing it's coming. So in Kathy Erndl, she describes being at a possession event where a young girl becomes possession, becomes a little mother, and she's speaking. But then Erndl looks to her left, and there's like an older woman in her 50s who suddenly goes into trance as well. It can happen. So that's the spontaneous one. Now we're remembering here that the cultivated possession is a spiritual and ritual practice. Over time, people will find greater ability when they go into trance to enter trance really easily and become possessed almost at will, but usually with some ritual around it. This is a blessing, not an affliction in any way. This isn't like the story that we heard about Christ and Legion. The person possessed, in fact, is worshipped along with the deity that possesses them. So if a person becomes possessed by the goddess Sheranvali, she who rides a tiger, then folk will then worship her, the goddess who's in the person, and the person who has the goddess in her, because to be possessed by the goddess is a sign of great purity. So we see this confusion where you're like, well, wait a minute. You've got a person who's possessed and you're making offerings to that person? And they'll say, yeah, because that person is a goddess. Now, remember, we're talking about Hindus here. They worship images. Now, some folks call them idolaters. It's a little more complicated than that. When you make a stone image or a brass image or any type of image in Hinduism, they ritually install the deity into the image. So the image has God within it, has a chunk of God within it. So one of the last things they do when they're like painting, when they're making a deity, is they paint the eyes on. They do a specific ritual. When they paint the eyes onto the image, then the image comes to life. So the idea of a goddess coming into a person is a little easier to understand. You can think of every time you look at an image of a goddess in a temple, that goddess has gone into, has really inhabited those images. So like I said, the person who is possessed, they make offerings to her, and they worship her in a sense because, one, she is the goddess, and two, she is pure enough to have the goddess come into her. Now, like I said, I reject these terms of demonic and divine possessions, preferring malevolent and benevolent. And for a couple of reasons. One, these are non-universal patterns of possession. So we have some classic horror movie images around. And the thing is, these are unique to us. They're very much unique to the story we just read about Jesus Christ. So I prefer to use more sort of functionalist arguments rather than metaphysical ones. So I don't care if something's a demon or a devil or an angel or a god. I'm curious how they work. So, or do they work for good? Do they bring goodness to the person who's possessed and the people around them? Or do they bring wickedness? If it's wickedness, well, all right, that's a problem. But I think malicious or malevolent and benevolent works a lot better than demonic versus divine. And because we only really think about demonic possession, we don't have a lot of good understandings or good examples in our Western, especially Protestant culture, of folk who are possessed for the good of things, or that have a malevolent form of possession. So a lot of scholars have argued that possession is entirely performative and that people are just acting, they're just doing something, and that there are actually no demons or gods or whatever, which I'm not interested in that argument at all. The entities who possess people should be considered actual conscious agents who speak through you. So when you're interviewing someone or you're at, well, you wouldn't interview a possessed person. But if you're describing a person who's possessed, you describe them as if they're gods. You should assume that they are being the god, that you're speaking with the god, because that's how it just kind of works. Now, trance and possession are very old and have been with us for quite a long time in India. Sanskrit sources describe possession phenomenon much as we see today, ranging back up to 1,000 years. So trance and possession should be thought of as sort of fundamental building blocks of religion, because we see them all over the place. And I'll give you a few examples in a minute. I mean, one thing you could ask is, are there actually spirits that possess people? I mean, but who cares? Who cares if they're real or not? I'm never interested in real or not real. I mean, we're studying human consciousness, and possession is just one of many modes of human consciousness, and it should be studied without the question of authenticity or inauthenticity. It is a mode that enables new religious contents to be generated by the possessed. When a possessed person says something, it could turn into scripture. There are even arguments that what is divinely inspired scripture, but a type of trance meditation or trance channeling, as I'd said. Or you could even consider it as a type of benevolent possession that enables someone to write scripture that comes from the lips of God through the human hand. So, like I said, we should kind of open up our ideas and think about different types of trances. So one of the earliest forms of a more kind of universal ideas about trance and possession are shaman. So we talked about what happens with a shaman. A shaman has a near-death experience, then they have a vision of a god or a goddess, and from that they have a new experience where that god or goddess is in them, or changes them, or initiates them in some way. So shaman trances can be considered a type of trance and a type of possession. What about Chinese spirit mediums? What do I mean by this? In Chinese culture, you have Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, but you also have folk religions that involve mediums. Here's actually a picture of a famous one from a documentary in which this woman goes into a trance and a local spirit takes her over, and then she can tell the future or tell you what you've been doing wrong recently and how you need to get your act together. So we see that this is actually really common throughout Chinese ethnic groups throughout the world, is people that go into trance that work as mediums. Tibetan oracles. So you have the Tibetan Buddhists who are very good monks and whatnot, but they also have oracles. These are people that go into trance and they tell the future and make predictions and whatnot. The Dalai Lama has a specific oracle that is associated with him. Tibetans will regularly, when they have an issue, they'll go talk to a lama, so a good monk, and get advice there, but they'll also consult oracles. And like I said, there is actually an oracle of the Tibetan government that is like the official oracle. So there's some state religion and possession. We have dance possessions. So trance and possession are often connected to ritualized dance. Here, the dancers become possessed through costumes and practices. Then they dance, and in that way, they keep the trance going, and they act as gods, giving an experience of the gods to the witnesses. So I'm talking about the Navadurga that I started with, and here's theyyam that we read about today. In this, we have people that dance And are they possessed before they dance? Are they possessed during the dance? Do they become possessed? They go in and out of possession? It's hard to say. You'd have to ask them. Every experience is different. But people use dance to act out or even invoke possession states in order to do various things. Here's another one, the Navadurga. As I talked about, every year you have these people in these masks that are usually men, and they go and they are possessed by the goddesses. And they are, in all effects, as they wander the streets, they are the 9 goddesses come to life. In the North American tradition, and to some degree Central American, you have the sun dance, in which people would dance themselves into a trance in which they would be suspended by hooks in their chests, and through that trance it allows them to commune with the gods, go to higher realms. These are long, extensive traditions. The few people I know that have done them in a traditional context have told me about just having powerful visionary experiences that to some degree overlap with possession, but it's more of a trance thing. All right, so let's look at some context. We've got 2 data sets that we're going to talk about today from India, one from North India and one from Southwest India. So first off, Northern India. So Erndl writes about the area of Delhi, Chandigarh, Punjab, Himachal Pradesh. So you see these areas on the map there. This is in many ways the predominant cultural zone of India. The India we most encounter in the West is this area. It's not places like Kerala or Tamil Nadu. There's widespread caste and wealth distributions. The gods generally have Sanskrit names. The godlings have similar vernacular ones. Main languages are Hindi and Punjabi, and sort of sub-dialects thereof. Now, Kerala is a little different. So Dalrymple is writing about Kerala. Kerala is like a wild, jungly place. Now, our word jungle actually comes from a Hindi term that means anywhere that is sort of like vegetative and out of bounds and crazy. So something is jungly if it's like overgrown. Okay, so Kerala describes itself as God's own country. The Brahmins there are some of the most formal. They have very distinct caste distinctions. You have very high Brahmins and then like a lot of laborers. Traditionally, it's said that there was an incarnation of God named Parashurama, and a bunch of Kshatriyas killed his mother, so he killed all of them and performed rituals with their blood. In order to expiate himself for all of his sins and for killing all the Kshatriyas, he actually went to Kerala and established a whole bunch of different religious practices. And it's thought that Parashuram brought the religion of Kerala to Kerala as a penance for all his sins above. So he made the Brahmins very high and the laborers very low. It's called God's own country. It's absolutely beautiful. I try to spend as much time as I can there. They have nearly universal literacy. They treat women remarkably well compared to anywhere else in India, and they have a communist government. So who said communism never did anything for you when you have Kerala, where it's one of the most delightful places to be in India with darn near universal literacy, and they treat women well. So that's a plus. Kerala has always been known as a land of tantra, magic, and serpent worship. You see serpent worship and snake worship and cobra worship and a lot of their folk practices. Theyyam actually comes from Kerala. Theyyam comes from the word daivam in Sanskrit, which just means being of the divinities. Daivam, deva, God, daiva, of the god, daivam, Theyyam. And their language is Malayalam, which is really hard. Okay, so what is the process and what is the function of possession? Dalrymple describes the process of the dancers praying to the god and then slowly getting ready for their performance by getting into their makeups and their costumes. And then before they go on, they stare into a mirror until they can see the god coming back. And then they say, they're gone. And it is just the god. And then they go out and they dance and they have these elaborate costumes. Many of them weigh a lot. They weigh like upwards of hundreds of pounds are the costumes that they wear, that they dance in. So it takes great physical strength to just do it. Kathleen Erndl describes a jagrat, which jagrat means something like to stay up all night. So it's a night vigil in which people stay up all night, usually singing hymns, what they call bhajans, are sort of like hymns. They're pretty catchy. They're fun. They stay up all night singing around them. Now, in northern India, what Erndl describes, she says that they install the goddess in a lamp, and then they do quite a bit of singing, and then there's a person who's known to be the little mother who they know is going to possess, usually a younger girl, will enter into the trance state. Now, like I said, these are all-night singing sessions. And then she also describes, Erndl describes, how a woman seemingly at random, spontaneously right next to her, went into possession. And I mean, I'll tell you, I've been to a bunch of these all-night singing things, and I was at one particular charismatic, I was staying with a guru at one point, and I was actually in a basement watching the gurus singing and leading these chants that was like way above and in like these giant rooms, and the sound was intense. And I looked around, and suddenly all these people just started freaking out. They just started moving all weird, and women whipping their heads around, and men who needed to be restrained, and people were just kind of holding them down gently, and they were having these powerful religious experiences. I'll tell you, actually, that one night, I kind of lost it a bit myself. I remember looking up and seeing on the guru's face, I saw the guru's face just fade into nothing, and all I could see was a skull singing at me. And this wasn't scary. It was like this realization of the intensity of life and of mortality. It wasn't scary in any way. And then I remember I just clicked out for a while. And I have some sense of that I was singing still, like I can remember breathing, but I remember losing time and just going into just this very beautiful, blissful place. So that's how I know I'm susceptible to trance and maybe to possession. I've never been possessed, but I will tell you, these all-night singing events, strange things can happen. So I've noticed in the patterns of every time I've seen people be possessed, what happens is there's some sort of a ritual, sometimes very vague. Then there's often some singing, some dancing, some ritualized music, staccato drums and whatnot. The god comes on, the people do whatever they're going to do as they're possessed, and then they usually calm down, and folk come forward, and you see this in theyyam, as Dalrymple describes, and ask that possessed person questions, and that person's able to answer as the gods. Even can give you answers to your problems, can tell you what's going wrong with your life, can tell you if you're going to be doing well in the future. It's like an oracular consultation. So what do people look like when they're possessed in India? Well, remember that possession is characterized by glazed eyes, though I often see people who are possessed having like wild eyes, not just glazed eyes. With women in particular, they whirl around their loose hair. You remember my discussion of hair before, how women will always have their hair very tight because if it's loose, it symbolizes sort of wild sexual energy and an openness to demonic possession and danger in that way. So remember, hair represents sexuality. So monks will either shave their hair to show their control or get their hair to dreadlocks to show control. So women whipping their hair around wildly, or men doing the same thing, is considered as that sign of being out of your mind, of being in a different state. So who are the people who are possessed? Now, I want you to remember, possession is natural. It's normal. It's not a scary thing. It's not a crazy thing like we think about in the West. It's not odd for a person to become possessed, and it's not odd for the person who becomes possessed, nor for the people who witness the possession. Folk actually cultivate this possession. So they'll do things like, in the weeks leading up to a possession experience or to theyyam dancing, they'll avoid alcohol and meat, and they'll restrain from sex. So they'll cultivate being in a state of purity to bring on the god and make the god comfortable coming to them. We do see on occasion that some people become spontaneously possessed. We see that most spontaneous possessions are female, in fact, and that when possession is cultivated, the actor is often male. That doesn't hold true, but in my experience, it has. Mostly those that cultivate these possession rituals will usually be males. Erndl describes sort of a woman going into possession, and that's true as well. But when I'm talking about these ritual dancers that are possessed, they are generally male. Yes, spontaneous possession happens in Jagrata, these all-night singings, when singing bhajans, which are hymns, or on pilgrimages. That'll often happen. Scholars have argued that there are just sort of like lower class people or underclass people, or Dalits, which mean like the beaten down people, or the little traditions of India. But when you really start looking around, you can see that there are pious and devoted people of all castes and of all social classes that will engage in possession, become possessed, or go and speak with possessed people. One way I like to think about it is that is that many of the folks who are possessed are pious and devoted. So dancers, temple folk, local religious personalities who are oracles. I like to see them as the people who become regularly possessed as sort of religious functionaries. Now, like I said, possession is a blessing, not an affliction. And in benevolent possession, you may see that one might become a holy madman, but one does not become a generally criminal madman. So there are groups in India that you will encounter that just act crazy all the time, and they're thought to be possessed by God, but in a good way. They call them holy madmen. They'll have a sort of like craziness because they're crazily intoxicated by their connection to God. So we do see that during festivals and holidays, women who are possessed will throng to pilgrimage temples in the north and set up shop. One thing I wanted to tell you about is there's a town called Malakutla, which has a remarkable amount of Hindu and Muslim, harmony. And there's a shrine to Haider Sheikh. Haider Sheikh there is a Muslim. Now, outside of his temple, you'll see Sikhs and Hindus will go there and become possessed, and then they'll speak for Haider Sheikh, and they'll become possessed by different entities around, and they sort of exist outside of the Dargah, outside of the tomb shrine. And it's intriguing that you have Hindus that go to a Muslim saint to become possessed, to do this sort of oracular work. Okay, in Kerala, the possessions happen in very specific contexts. The rituals of dance that are found, these are rituals of dance, and they're found in these places called kuva or kua. Now, kuva or kua means like a wilderness ritual space or a wilderness place. So these aren't found in sort of big temples where you'd have Brahmins and Sanskritic gods. Now, sometimes these days, because theyyam surprisingly is becoming more and more popular, and in fact, the state of Kerala advertises it during theyyam season for tourists to go and witness theyyam. So traditionally happens amongst outcast people, even though Brahmins come to the performances and consult with the oracles. But the people that have become possessed, the other 9 months out of the year, they work as laborers. Haridas, in fact, we read about, was trained by his father. He showed an aptitude in his youth, and then he was formally trained later. Now, it's hard work, and a lot of them consume quite a bit of alcohol in their possessed state. They consume alcohol because the gods consume alcohol when they possess people, whereas they wouldn't at normal times. So he says it's very hard on their bodies, and a lot succumb to drink. And he says like the life expectancy of a theyyam dancer is about 50 years. It's not too long. I don't have much time left. Okay, so, but who are the deities that possess? Well, in the north, the great deities of, say, Shiva or Vishnu do not possess people. Now, you have other gods like a Bhairava, who's like a wrathful form of Shiva, or Hanuman, who's the monkey god, will possess people. But these are gods that are also known to help in exorcism. They're called Bhutnats. I should have a slide on this. Bhutnat means something like ghost lord. So you have two poles. You have like these high gods that are transcendent, and then you have some lower gods who are immanent. They are around us in the world. And we find that the same deities that have temples where people go to have exorcism done, these are the same deities that tend to possess other people. So in Kerala, it is gods and goddesses who are all very fierce, who take over men in the specific theyyam context. In theyyam, we see that these rituals are being sponsored by various folks, maybe in thanks for something because they were healed from an illness or got a whole bunch of, or came into a bunch of money, or maybe to call for help or aid in a problem or call for a healing. The goddesses that we read about, and I want to specifically turn here to Erndl, we read about how it's goddesses who generally possess folk. There's an argument that all goddesses are one, that they are all one manifestation of one essential entity, but I don't care for that. They're their own thing. Each goddess is the same. But in this case, you see that a lot of goddesses throughout North India can be worshipped as this goddess who rides a tiger, who doesn't really kind of have a formal name the same way that a Durga or a Saraswati or a Lakshmi has. This goddess that rides this tiger is found all over India, but I would argue like I said, she's not a single goddess. She's a stand-in for the myriad of local goddesses that can possess. Possession, whether it's embodied as a male or a female, is most often comes from goddesses. We do see that all around. Goddesses can be separated into two sort of categories. You have Saumya and Raudra. We have Saumya, who are the pleasant ones, and Raudra, the fierce ones. Now, in Kerala, you have big gods like Vishnumurti, who takes on a wrathful form that Haridas dances out, and also gods like Bhairava, but we also see Kali and Chamundi, who are two wrathful goddesses from the north that are found in these theyyam dancers that we read about today. Okay, so here's at the end, but at the end I want to say that possession, trance, and oracular experiences are not so foreign after all. In the Greek culture, we have the Pythia, from which we get the word python. The Pythia was an oracle of Apollo that folk would go and consult. She would sit on a three-footed stool, and over a crack in the earth where there would be sort of a natural volcanic sort of emanations that would come out. She would hold laurels, and she would go into a trance, and rulers and local people, whoever, could ask her to divine. So she would become possessed by Apollo and by the spirit of the Python, the Pythia, and then she could answer questions. So this idea of benevolent possession isn't something that's just found in India, but it's a category we can use to understand interactions with deities found around the world. Thank you very much. I will see you next.